At position 6 and 7 on the map are the remains of two dwellings, Railway Cottage and above that Cann House. It's remarkable that this cottage is still standing, albeit it's a ruin. Travelling along the cycle path it is easy to see. Not so easy to find is the remains of Cann House, which requires a steep climb up the path behind the railway cottage. It's here I will start. What I'm trying to do is to draw out what appears to be Cann House as it may have been. It's very scanty evidence, but looking at this Plimbridge Woods Guide, which was published, well, quite a long time ago, but put together by David Muir. But there's an etching which was produced probably around 1831 or thereabouts. According to Ernie Hoblin, it says here, the cottage or Cann House or Cann Quarry House, built as a suitably grand dwelling of the owner or manager. The walls of this building are still visible in the woods to the south of the quarry, and is depicted in an etching dated 1831, showing it to have been what an estate agent would now call a large dormer bungalow in idyllic surroundings with gardens around it and outhouses to the rear. What I've done is to hone right in on this and get a very blurred image. But basically this is what I'm working from. Now what appears to be happening is that there seems to be a veranda around the outside and these pillars holding out up the roof. Now I don't know, there's a couple of dormers at the top here, a couple of chimneys and a little feature on the top. Something else on the end that I can't really work out. But there seems to be a chimney here. This is what I'm working on, and I'm going to see just a general look at what it may have looked like. The drawing suggests that the cottage was supposed to be in a chalet style. The roof suggested was in an L-shaped configuration. Let's look at it with a little colour added. The ruin suggests something less grandiose, but nonetheless, with a little imagination and some basic facts, it may have looked similar to this. The earliest reference to the railway cottage and Cann Quarry House can be found on a lease reservation dated 1828. The railway cottage was known as the foreman's cottage, whereas the grander house above, the manager's house. The etching indicates the foreman's house as being in place and at least planned in 1831. Charles Pike possessed the lease from Lord Morley in 1845. In 1849, Thomas Pearson arrived at the house, first to occupy with his wife and children, plus a brother Henry, and a cook and a maid and a coachman. He called himself a merchant proprietor. By 1851, Pearson was declared bankrupt with debts of £6,800. However, Charles Pike worked on until the late 1850s. In 1863, the Cann and Rumpel's quarries were taken over by the Plym River Slab and Slate Company, but by 1868 the quarry had gone quiet again. The 1871 census indicates that the agricultural worker Thomas Harris lived at Cann with his wife and his family, but it's more likely that he lived at the railway cottages. By 1881, the census indicates that James Soper, master of the slate quarry, lived at Cann House with his wife. You may recall Soper lived in the cottages that were subsequently demolished at Rumpel 30 years earlier. He employed 4 men and a boy. One, Robert Salton, a clay labourer, plus his 2 children, is indicated on the census. In the 1891 census, James Soper, aged 71, was recorded as a slate merchant. He was the last to occupy the house, it seems. Beyond this time, it seemed to have fallen into disrepair. Nearby are the remains of what must have been the stables. The censuses were made since the 1800 Census Act, and information was collected every 10 years to estimate the change in the population. The 1841 census and thereafter was more systematic in noting down occupants. Before 1841, details became more sketchy. The 1841 census shows Eusebia Martin, aged 35, living at the cottage with his wife and daughter. By 1861, the census Thomas Harris, a Chelsea pensioner, and his wife were not associated with the quarry, living at the cottage. By 1863, the Cann and Rumpel quarries were taken over by the Plym River Slab and Slate Company, but by 1868 the quarry had gone quiet. The 1871 census shows that an agricultural worker called Thomas Harris and his wife and his family lived at the cottage. In 1881 census, the employment was probably much more to do with railways. 2 families, William Gulleys, his wife and 6 children, plus a lodger, and James Arthur Beavis, his wife and his daughter, occupied the cottage. Cann Quarry's last operator was Edward Gullett, nephew of James Gullett, who once operated Rumpel Quarry several years previously. He and his family, his wife Sarah, his disabled son Harry, and his sister, known as Polly, and grandsons Francis and Percy Locke, and 2 lodgers were recorded as occupying the cottage in 1901. It must have been pretty crowded. The quarry was worked out of slate, and elven roadstone was worked. So they had sidelines in operation, providing tea for weekend visitors coming up on the train or going for hikes. They stayed even after Edward's death in 1915 until 1920s. In more recent years, various people occupied the cottage up until 1955. After that, it became tumble down. The National Trust bought the woodland in 1968, the cottages being part of Isaac Foot's estate after his death in 1960. Around the back of the cottage are the remains of a privy and a pigsty, and a little way up the pathway that runs uphill towards Cann House there is a spring which is worked into the structure of the wall. Perhaps this is where the cottage drew its water. Later on in the life of the cottage, one of the disused water wheels in Cann Quarry was set up to generate electricity.